Our third speaker tonight is Dympna McGlade. Dympna is a proud North Belfast woman whose family and her mother and father I had the privilege of knowing, especially our mother and father, Frank and Rebecca, for many years until they departed us. They were two of the most selfless people I ever met in my life. Frank interned in the 40s and the 50s and the 70s, was continually abused by this state, as was Rebecca. It is little wonder that Rebecca and him were so much to the forefront of the civil rights movement, because while nationalists and Catholics were certainly discriminated against, Republicans were crucified by the Special Powers Act. And over those years, Republicans really understood what it was like, finally, in '67, to have a vehicle that could challenge this. So I'll hand over to Dympna.
Thanks, Vicky. Thank you. I've been involved in the 50th Anniversary Committee, and I was also involved in the 40th Anniversary Committee. And we've had a lot of conferences and debates, and I've attended most of them. I've come to the conclusion that the claims around who was involved in civil rights, how they were involved, why they were involved, there's no agreement on it. And I was saying to Malky earlier on, it's like we refer to beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. I listened carefully in particular to what people had to say about republicanism and civil rights, and I observed in general that it tends to be played down, sometimes ignored, sometimes criticised, whilst the roles of others are played up and celebrated. Revisionists also have tried to either rewrite Republicans out of the civil rights history or to write in other organisations that didn't even exist at the time, or else they depict the Republican movement's intentions in civil rights as somehow dishonest or dishonourable. I think it's time that the Republican movement be given its proper place in the civil rights history book, so therefore I welcome tonight's event, that we'll look more closely at it, and it was good to hear from the two previous speakers. I don't purport to be an expert in the history of the Republican movement, and I don't know exactly about the Wolf Tone Society and the Republican clubs and how they became involved in civil rights. And the speakers before me give a good history of that, so I'm not going to even attempt to try and analyse it. But what I will attempt to give you is a potted history of my parents' involvement in the civil rights movement, with the idea that it will give you an idea of how one working class Republican family were involved during the 60s, 70s and over their lifetime. And the reason is that I think it's not dissimilar to other Republicans who were involved in civil rights at the time. And I also think that it's important to give personal narratives because we get a lot of historical narratives, and there needs to be a merge of both so we get a total story. So I'm introducing you to Frank and Rebecca McGlade. There's a picture of them on their wedding day. For those of you who know them, it's a bit of a love story as well. They were deeply devoted to each other as well as to the Republican movement. My father grew up not too far from here in a place called The Bone, in an old terrace house, so it used to be mill-owned, with an outside toilet and the bathtub hanging in the yard. I'm sure others remember houses like that as well. My own father, his father died when he was only 2 years old, and according to local people in The Bone, they were the poorest family in the area. In 1924, at the age of 12, and with their mother's blessing, my father and his older brother Charlie were sworn into the junior wing of the IRA. For the duration of the Second World War, my father was interned on the prison ship Alrata in the middle of Strangford Lough, and then they were moved to Derry Jail and Crumlin Road Prison. He met and married my mother when he was released at the age of 32, and they had 5 children. We lived with my granny in the Bone because I don't think they could afford to live anywhere else, and my father wasn't working most of the time, he's doing other things. So my grandmother was there when he was interned or on the run to help with the family and raise the children. He was interned in the 60s in the Curragh and then in the 70s in Long Kesh. So for practically every decade from the 1930s, he spent some time in jail. He also spent an annual week in jail for selling Easter lilies. He was lifted a few times during the year for selling the United Irishman paper or collecting for the Irish language, and spent time overnight in jail. And Republicans were rounded up and incarcerated when the Royals visited the North, so he'd done some time here and there as well. All in all, he spent 12 years in prison without trial. He died at the age of 66 in 1977 with no criminal record to his name. Nevertheless, my parents lay the blame for all of their woes at the door of the British government for enabling and supporting an unjust government in Northern Ireland to operate a regime of discrimination, oppression and sectarianism. They often quoted Theobald Wolfe Tone, "England, the never-failing source of all our political evils." We grew up with that quote, among other Connolly and other Wolfe Tone and others quotes. They both hated sectarian bigotry, and they were also interested in international politics. And when I was sent down to the co-op to do the shopping, I had a long list of boycott titles. So there was no South African, no Israeli, no Tate and Lyle. So there wasn't much to choose from on the shelf by the time I had to go down that list. My parents wholeheartedly supported the IRA ceasefire in 1962. And when the formation of the Civil Rights Association came, we had a reversal of roles in our house. My father, who by then had a bad heart, took a back seat and supported my mother, who became a member of the Civil Rights Executive. She was the Assistant Secretary. My father stayed at home and looked after my oldest brother, Donal, who had severe learning difficulties, and kept an eye on all of us at home. I was 11 in 1968, Sean 13, Cahill 15, and Breed was at Queen's and became active in the People's Democracy. So step forward, Rebecca, and you'll see her there, the wee woman in the white dress, sort of to the right of Betty Sinclair, who's got a coat over her arm. You can see her there. That is of particular interest for me, I think, because the previous speakers talked about the diversity of people who were involved in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And the picture includes trade unionists, communists, the Republican clubs, Wolfe Tone Society, the Campaign for Social Justice. That was just some of them, but it gives you a good idea of just the kind of breadth of people who were involved. So my mother had been in Common Demand whenever she was young, but once she got married, she took a back seat to support my father and look after the family. It was her turn now to take up the mantle and become a prominent figure on all the civil rights demonstrations. My father accompanied her whenever he could, and sometimes he even brought us along with him. As the marches and pickets intensified, our family continued to be harassed by the RUC, and then along came the Paisleyites. Because she had become prominent in the civil rights campaign, my mother was then a target for harassment, discrimination and threats from the state and the Paisleyites. And loyalists attempted to shoot her in the 70s and made a death threat against her in the 80s when she went to work in the Shankill as a care worker. But she was inspired by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association and the people involved in it, and how they had come together despite their differences to campaign for justice and reform. And she was proud that NICRA campaigned under the slogan, non-violent, non-sectarian, non-political. Throughout these hard times, my parents continued to keep the lines that they had already developed with loyalists. They kept them open. And on the 30th anniversary of my father's death, we gathered some memories from people who had come to know them over the years. And this was a quote from a letter we received from Gusty Spence. Leaving aside for a second their devotion to republicanism, they were of the people and for the people, the have-nots, the working class to the core, asking for nothing for themselves except for justice for all, irrespective of class or creed. So when the IRA split came, my parents opposed the return to the violent struggle and continued their political route. Our family already had the state forces and loyalism to contend with, and now we had a third oppressor in the form of the provisional IRA, who threatened and harassed and even pulled a gun on my father, which luckily didn't go off. At times, being the only stickies in the bone was hard. It was like being the only guys in the village. For all these reasons, it was a difficult struggle for us to be involved in the civil rights campaign, but we were, and there was certainly no personal or party political gain in it for my parents or for the family. So I'm a bit bewildered whenever people talk about the Republican plot that Marion referred to. First of all, I agree with Marion. NICRA was made up of a variety of different organisations, and no one group were in a position to control its direction. Secondly, Republicans were entitled to believe in a united Ireland, but were trying to achieve this through peaceful means. Thirdly, Republican families like ours suffered at the hands of the state, loyalists and other so-called Republicans because they supported the civil rights struggle. I don't think that's hardly a Republican plot. To its shame, the British supported and promoted the Northern Ireland government's accusation that NICRA was a front for Republican and communist ideologies. In my view, the civil rights movement was the real peace process, and had it been handled properly, it could have avoided the next 30+ years of violence and death. I believe the Good Friday Agreement's key focus is more on the healing the divisions caused by the conflict. Out of necessity, it's more focused on healing the division caused by the conflict and on the establishment and maintenance of a failed political process. I strongly believe that if NICRA had been asked to help draft such an agreement during its time, it would have had a better focus on social justice and equality for the collective society rather than the two tribes approach. I want to leave you with the words of the late Paddy Ashdown, who was billeted at the bottom of our street in the early 70s, so late 69, 70, the early 70s, and had a bit of an altercation with my father, but we had written to him as well, asking him to say what had happened and to give us some of his thoughts. So he said, "I had been a keen observer of the Civil Rights Association, which in hindsight I realise that the opportunity to avoid 37 years of conflict could have been avoided or minimised if we had listened and acted upon the key equality and justice issues which NICRA was campaigning for." So I hope you found the McGlade story a useful insight into the role of Republicans in civil rights. Thank you.